This is lecture 3, Representing the Human Body. It focuses on race and gender. Take a look at this artwork. How do you go about analyzing an artwork like this? The artist is Patricia Rodriguez, and the title of the work is Josefa Juanita. And it's from La Historia de California calendar from 1977. It's a silk screen. I took the image from Online Archive of California, and it describes the artwork as a magenta, ochre, and brown image of a woman's profile. In addition, we see that it has the word abril, which in Spanish means April. So this would be the page that corresponds to the month of April in the calendar. In addition, we have text, and I've transcribed it here. So let's read. Josefa was a Mexican woman who was accused of killing a man who had abused her, and who, following a trial of dubious impartiality, was condemned to die on the gallows. The execution took place on July 5, 1851, in the town of Downeyville, where Josefa lived, making this the first documented case in the history of California in which a woman was condemned to die by hanging. So that's what it says here. And then the rest is talking about different women, for example, Third World women, and Inez Garcia and Yvonne Wanrow, who also sustained abuse from males, in their case from their partners. Notice that it's showing solidarity to women from all over the world, in this case, Third World women. So it's linking the experiences of more contemporary women to those of Josefa in 1851. The other thing is that 1851 gives us another clue. 1851 is after the Mexican-American War, which lasted from 1846 to 1848, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which I covered in lecture 1, and therefore California is populated by a lot of Mexicans, and obviously indigenous peoples too. But also, in 1849, gold was discovered in California, and that's when the gold rush began. And the gold rush attracted people from all over the world seeking to go into gold mining. And California experienced a lot of immigration. But one thing we must keep in mind as well is that Josefa had a husband, and he was forced to leave town after Josefa's execution. Josefa's story is pretty well known, particularly in this region of California. Look at this image by William Downey, known as Hunting for Gold, which he made in 1893. And look, he wrote in his image, Hanging of the Mexican Woman. He also wrote a book about his experiences as a miner, and he devotes a chapter to Josefa, and the title is Lynching a Beauty. Another miner, Franklin Buck, who had witnessed the execution, also said the following. Then at Downeyville, I always think of the Spanish girl standing on the plank of the bridge, tossing her hat to a friend and putting the rope around her neck, folding her hands and facing death with a bravery that made its men ashamed. Pobre Josefa. And girls were so scarce in those days too. Oh, I misspelled that. So notice that the story surrounding Josefa focuses on the spectacle of the execution, but also her gender. And here she is being executed and completely surrounded by males. So this episode highlights both race and gender relations at this time in California. At this plaque dedicated to the memory of Juanita, let's read. The Spanish woman, also known as Josefa, was hung off the Jersey Bridge July 5, 1851, a short distance downstream from this spot for the murder of Frederick Alexander Augustus Cannon. Cannon and his friends were celebrating Independence Day, and after closing most of the saloons, they passed Jose and Josefa's cabin. He broke the door down. However, history did not tell what happened. The next morning, he came back supposedly to apologize. An argument ensued, and Josefa stabbed Cannon fatally in the heart. A mob trial was held, and she was sentenced to death. Josefa climbed the scaffold without the least trepidation and placed the rope around her own neck. Her last words were, "I would do the same again if I was so provoked." There is so much to unpack here. First of all, Josefa is repeatedly called Juanita, a generic name given to all Mexican women, and the other generic name was the Spanish girl. By contrast, we are given the full name of the assailant, who happens to be a white man. We have his complete name. We even have a middle name and 2 last names. Also, we're not given any details about the trauma that Josefa sustained. It just vaguely says history did not tell what happened. The details or the nature of the attack are not as explicit as the fact that supposedly Frederick came to apologize, and that's where she stabbed him. Significantly, the mock trial was held. They reportedly deliberated for 2 hours. It took 2 hours for the jury to convict her and sentence her to death. And look at Josefa's story reported in December of 2019 in an article by Brittany Mejia in the Los Angeles Times. The article's title is "She Was Hanged in California 168 Years Ago for Murder or for Being Mexican." One of the things that the article focuses on is the issue of gender. For example, it says, Downeyville and the surrounding area's fascination with the story of Josefa predates the era of #MeToo and modern-day hostility toward anyone and anything Mexican. Before the El Paso mass shooting and the president conjuring up Mexican rapists and drug dealers to get elected. But in their own way, the town's 200 residents have long debated the role Josefa's gender and ethnicity played in her fate. In fact, a local couple could not agree on gender relations today in the 21st century, but they did agree on one thing, which is racism is part of America, period. Josefa had no standing in this society. If she weren't Spanish or Mexican, any jury would have acquitted her. And Mejia also quotes Downey's book, "The luster in her eyes, shown in various degrees, from the soft, dove-like expression of a love-sick maiden to the fierce scowl of an infuriated lioness, according to her temper, which was the only thing not well balanced about her." Once again, the focus is not on her state of mind. And look at what Maite Rojas, on an excellent article on Josefa's story, says. In theorizing Chicana female sexuality and the role of the Mexican female body in the U.S. cultural and literary imaginary, there continues to be a need to investigate the physical and imaginative positioning of Mexican women in Gold Rush, California, and the role that they played within early articulations of the nation and the racialized and sexualized discourses of manifest destiny. Josefa's story, how it unfolds and how it is remembered, suggests much about the ways in which Euro-Americans viewed Mexican women in the 19th century. Distorted by such misnomers as Juanita and the Spanish woman, Josefa stands in as every woman for the many Mexican women who have been erased from American history. Moreover, the nature of her experience marks the central role that sexual politics played in shaping and limiting Mexican female subjectivity, as well as in responding to the nation's ethnically diverse landscape. While the events that occurred in 1851, one day after California celebrated its first 4th of July as an official state, were recorded in numerous ways, it was the fascination with Josefa's sexuality and physical agency that dominated most descriptions. And so what we see this artwork by Rodriguez, in which the artist has portrayed Josefa's face, and she's not looking at the viewer, but is depicted in a manner in which Josefa appears pensive and introspective, perhaps unaware or not caring about our gaze. So lecture 3 will cover 2 things. I'm going to try to define what is race or ethnicity, as well as gender and sexuality. And then we're going to look at a few artworks by Chicanx artists and see how they express these concepts in the. Let's define ethnicity and race. And let's begin by saying these are loaded terms like gender and sex. very difficult to define or explain, especially because they're artificial. They're simultaneously based on biological traits, so that would be race, and cultural constructions, which is ethnicity. But you might say, well, then race is science-based. And even though scientists have shown that there's only one race, the human race, and that people simply resemble their parents, nevertheless, there are some biological traits that are passed on to the offspring. So race is based on appearances. For example, skin color, the structure of the face or the body. But then again, you're thinking, what about eye or hair color? For example, if you have black hair or blonde hair, you might still be considered white, or people with blue eyes versus green or brown eyes and things like that. So that's why it's very difficult to define. And then ethnicity has to do with cultural traits, language, religion, diet, traditions. And because both race and ethnicity are based on cultural norms, these are subject to change. Let me give you another example. Jewish is often considered a race in Europe, but an ethnicity in the United States. Why? And it's puzzling because this is a religion. Moreover, you will find that there's a lot of Jewish people who look white, but then there's Jewish people from Ethiopia who are Black, and also in Asia, and obviously in the Middle East. And the last thing I'm going to say about that is that the US Constitution states in Article 1 that a census must be taken every 10 years. And the US Census listed Spanish American as a racial category. And that referred to someone originated from Spanish-speaking countries. But in the 1970s, Hispanic was added. But even this is actually a little complicated because not everyone from Latin America is Hispanic. In fact, there are countries that were colonized by the Dutch or the French or the Portuguese. For example, Brazil is Latin American, but it's not Hispanic because Hispanic refers to Spanish. And now the US Census considers Latinx as an ethnicity. Now let's focus on equally complicated terms. Let's define biological sex. And look what I have here. Biological sex are traits determined by chromosomes. So it's either male, female, or intersex. And for example, for the male and female, babies born male or female, they would be cisgender if their biological sex lines up with the gender identity, meaning you see the child's genitalia and they line up with identifying as male or female. But cisgender is not universal, of course. Now, gender identity is self-identifying with a gender, and it's on a spectrum. And this definitely is a social construction in that, for example, in the West, this is binary. There's a strong focus on male or female identities, and those two are complementary. And at least for us in the West, we take things like genitalia, careers, clothing, even the color blue and pink, to refer to gender identity. One of the things that gender, the idea of gender does, is that it distributes privileged positions to some, but disadvantages others. And that's patriarchy, where male traits are valued more than female traits. And that leads to gender stratification or inequality. Male traits would be things associated with power, with strength, making sure your voice is heard, using what we consider male garments, whereas female traits would be passivity, submissiveness, maternal instincts, caregiver, dresses, and things like that. And when I say valued more, that we place greater value intrinsically, but also monetarily. And that relates to the inequality of equal pay, for example. And all of this relates to a concept called intersectionality, which many people of color have been expressing for a long time. And Kimberly Crenshaw named intersectionality, which is multiple dimensions of disadvantage resulting from interplay of race, class, gender, etc. And then sexual orientation entails a spectrum of identities. This has nothing to do with biological sex or gender identity. It has to do with the gender identity or identities that any one person finds attractive in a partner. And last, let me talk a little bit about feminism, which is so vast a term because there's so many forms of feminism, but generally it opposes patriarchy and sexism and supports social equality for all genders. However, ideas of feminism began early on in the 1840s with the movement for abolition, the abolition of slavery in the United States. And when women began to notice that they themselves were being subjugated by the patriarchy, they began to advocate for many things, including the right to vote. And it took decades of arduous work, but they eventually earned a win with a 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. And as I mentioned in lecture 1, newly freed male slaves had been given the right to vote in 1865 with the 15th Amendment. One important aspect of feminism was that women of color felt excluded from the core values of feminism, which tended to ignore or exclude the experiences of, say, Latinx women. Not surprisingly, there's many forms of feminism because some people who say they are feminists, they want to establish reforms, for example, the 19th Amendment, but maintain existing institutions of power. And more radical feminism dislike that because they think that capitalism, by its very nature, supports the patriarchy. And they think that socialism might be able to help this. And even more radical feminists think that we must eliminate existing gender categories to really reach true equality. Gender, the way that we practice it in the West right now, gives us some very strong ideas of what females and also what males are supposed to be like. And so any deviation from that or any hint of ambiguity causes great discomfort. And that's what leads to discrimination and inequalities. Who defines these ideas about ethnicity and race and also gender and sex? The dominant group, of course, defines these categories and ensures that they are observed. For example, just yesterday, I was listening to news that, and by the way, I'm taping this, the election 2020 for president. Reporters were saying that Kamala Harris, just like Barack Obama, are not really Black. And so they're defining categories. And even though both of them have experienced racism because of the color of their skin and their identity as Black people, given that they're seeking the highest echelons of society, people in the dominant group want to define their identity for them. And we probably should ask, why do these categories exist then? Well, they exist to oppress. It's a question of power. Those categories uphold hierarchies. And we have individual racism, in which as an individual person may have racist tendencies. And there's also structural racism, which is the institutions in our society, for example, schools, businesses, banking system, etc. They have a structure that keeps people in place based on their gender and their ethnicity. And so are these categories important? Absolutely yes. If we pretend that they don't exist, it leads to more repression and it silences the voices of the people who are oppressed by this system. So now going back to the art, how do Chicana or Chicanx artists articulate their identities? And that would be racial and gender, ethnic and gender. They do so by using visual and historic devices, as the example of Rodriguez's artwork shows. Let's see how or if the concepts that we just studied on gender and ethnicity could help us analyze an artwork like this. Its title is Three Eagles Flying by the Chicana artist Laura Aguilar, which she made in 1990. It's a black and white photograph featuring a female nude in the center with a flag on either side of her. It's a photograph triptych in that it has 3 panels. And in the central one is a female nude. We know she's female because the breasts are fully exposed. And she's flanked by 2 flags. To the viewer's right is the Mexican flag, right here. To the viewer's left is the US flag. I'm just noticing that this one still has the hooks to hang it, whereas this one does not. It's important to notice details, small details like that, because that adds to the meaning that the artwork has for us. The female stands bounded by a very thick rope. See it around the neck, waist, hands, and upper legs. And a Mexican flag has been draped around her head to cover it completely. And where her face would be, instead of her gaze, we are looking directly at the eagle that graces the central panel of the Mexican flag. And draped as a skirt around her hip, pubic, and leg area is the US flag. So only from that brief description, many questions emerge. For example, why the female nude? And also, why the inclusion of flags and a rope? And why does she appear to be bounded? And look what Charlene Villaseñor Black said. She's a leading art historian about Aguilar's artwork. She says, "Three eagles flying resists an easy reading. Aguilar challenges the idea of the female nude, one of the most important genres in Western art, as a passive object of the male gaze. It's very clear that she's aware of the tradition and she's able to repeat certain elements from the canon in such a way that shows us how unstable that meaning is and to question these essentialized ideas about women." Something that Villaseñor Black said stayed with me and helped me to appreciate and understand Three Eagles Flying a little bit better. It's this thought. She says, it's very clear that she's aware of the tradition of the female nude. Look at this painting by the French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme, titled The Slave Market from 1866. It features a female nude in the center of the composition, and the setting is a non-existent place in Northern Africa or the Middle East. This is a good example of how European artists, starting in the 16th century, represented the female nude. The females are usually very passive and often exotic. In fact, in some circles in Europe, nudity, even in painting, was not permissible. This is a great example of the contexts in which female nudes were permissible. One of the things that European artists do, starting in the 16th century and all the way through the 19th, as you can see here, is that they depicted the female in a landscape. In this case, it's a market. And not always, but very often, it was in the context of classical Western mythology. For example, Greek and Roman myths. Let's consider what Linda Nochlin, in her seminal article, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, said, "In the period extending from the Renaissance until near the end of the 19th century, a period in which careful and prolonged study of the nude model was essential to the training of every young artist, to the production of any work with pretensions to grandeur, and to the very essence of history painting, generally accepted as the highest category of art. Indeed, it was argued by defenders of traditional painting in the 19th century that there could be no great painting with clothed figures, since costume inevitably destroyed both the temporal universality and the classical idealization required by great art." It's important to keep in mind also that what Nochlin is saying in this article is that female artists were seldom allowed in the most prestigious institutions of learning, much less allow them life drawing classes from the nude. Consider this nude painted in the late 1640s by one of the most renowned European artists, the Spanish Diego Velázquez, who was born in Seville. Its title is the Rugby Venus, and it's an oil on canvas. At first glance, it seems to be a realistic portrayal. Her luminescent skin contrasts nicely with the loose and free brushstrokes that he seems to have used for the drapery, for the fabrics. Upon closer examination, we see that this is a mythical figure, a little Cupid, the god of love. Look at the wings. And he's holding a mirror that he probably took down from the wall where it was hanging with these strings. And we can see the female reflected on that mirror, and she's blushing a little bit. So we see Velázquez's exquisite technique in the brushstrokes. We also see the creativity that Velázquez uses in portraying the female nude in the traditional mythological setting. Nevertheless, viewers in the 1600s would have noticed that this could have been any room in people's homes. Now, this painting has been and continues to be highly admired, and it gained some popular notoriety because in 1914, suffragette Mary Richardson came to the National Gallery in London and with a knife tried to destroy Velázquez's painting. And here's a photograph of the damage. Fortunately, curators were able to repair. Now, the press tried to portray this event as though Richardson had committed a murder. Richardson was taken into custody, and in her defense in court, Mary Richardson said, "I have tried to destroy the picture of the most beautiful woman in mythological history as a protest against the government for destroying Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst, who is the most beautiful character in modern history." So this was in protest of the treatment that suffragettes, people who were asking for the right to vote, received from the government in early 20th century England. They were beaten, tortured, harassed. And the point that Mary Richardson was trying to make is that a lot of time is that there's more value placed in the painting of a naked woman like that many have argued is there to satisfy the male gaze than the real life women. And the point about the value placed in the work of females and their human experience is strengthened by the observations of the guerrilla girls almost a century later. It was, and look at the lithograph that they made, asking, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? The Met Museum being one of the most prestigious institutions for the exhibition of art. And they're pointing out that less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of them are nude females. So going back to the three eagles flying, is this female nude also there only for the enjoyment of the male gaze? Is it portrayed in the context of myth, of a made-believe world? And that is very important because somehow, even though she's bound, the message, at least for me, is about being bound by what these two symbols represent. Here's where her ethnicity and gender become even more relevant. And I found this that Laura Aguilar said in the 1980s. She said, "What I'm trying to do is to provide a better understanding of what it's like to be a Latina and a lesbian. Within the lesbian and gay community of Los Angeles, people of color are yet another hidden subculture. We are present, but remain unseen." I don't necessarily think that we must always look to the artist to see what they meant to be expressing, because a work of art should move you into new ways of thinking or feeling, even though that may not have been the intention of the artist. For example, on some level, some may think that Three Eagles Flying is more representative of Aztec goddesses with their breasts exposed, or even this Paleolithic stone sculpture known as the Woman or Venus from Willendorf from 24,000 before the Common Era, but her face is not visible, only her gender. And we know that she's a female with the breasts fully exposed. And then thousands of years later, Aztec sculptors, who are world-renowned for their exquisite skills in sculpture and carving, gave us these goddesses who also appear with their breasts exposed. You can see them on this monolith of Coyolxauhqui and over here in Coatlicue, the mother of Coyolxauhqui and the mother of the tutelary god of the Aztecs, the most important god for the Aztecs, which is Huitzilopochtli. And to be Three Eagles Flying was very reminiscent of Coatlicue, even though Coatlicue here is represented as beheaded, and these serpents over here representing blood. And Coatlicue is known as skirt, snake's skirt. Coyolxauhqui means bells on her cheeks. And here they are. And so Three Eagles Flying is imbued with so much more meaning for me after thinking about the words of Charlene Villaseñor Black and what the artist Laura Aguilar said herself, and also the fact of this iconography with the flags. Because Chicanas have often expressed this idea that they feel that they belong to two places, and they're stuck in between as this female nude, which happens to be a self-portrait. So she's stuck in between these two cultures, these two governments, and this one is very strong because she was born here and she spoke English and complained she could not speak Spanish fluently. Which evoke what Gloria Ansaldúa in her book Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza expressed about Chicanas feeling in between many worlds, not just the world of the United States and Mexico, but the world of language, of ethnicity, of gender. And then when we take into consideration all those ideas, including the female nude, the experiences of Chicana in their own country, in the United States, and the deep ties that Chicanx people in general feel to Mexico. Because, as we will discuss in the next lecture, there's always been a constant back and forth, and many states in the Southwest were Mexican before 1848. And so the ties haven't just died out. They continue to be felt very strongly. A couple of more things that I will say is that when we look at Mexican traditions and Mexican myth, actually, when we look at the history of Mexico and their impact on Chicanas, it's significant that the Mexican flag is draping her head, and that and then the male gaze, or even any viewer's gaze, would be confronted by an eagle. And that eagle with a snake on its beak is representing a very powerful myth for the Aztecs. It's called the myth of migration, in which there were wandering tribes, and their tutelary god, or the most important god, Huitzilopochtli, told them that they would wander and continue searching until they found a place that would have the following sign. It would have a cactus, the prickly pear cactus, growing out of a rock, and an eagle would be perched on that cactus, and the eagle would have a snake on its beak. And Huitzilopochtli said to the Aztecs, that will be the place where you shall establish a city and become a great nation. And so, as we will discuss in the next lecture, that becomes a very powerful myth, because Chicanas are often made to feel in the United States that they don't belong, that they're immigrants or outsiders. And in the 1960s movements, youth were incarcerated for protesting in the streets. They protested police brutality and lack of resources, especially education. They were protesting poor conditions at school with bad teachers, bad textbooks, and dilapidated buildings, but also the excessive policing that was making youth feel deviant. And many youth who were wrongly incarcerated, lawyers said against them that the Chicano youth is violent because they're descendants from the Aztecs. And then Chicanx people began to explore more deeply this aspect of their identity, and began to see a glorious pre-contact past. And these myths, therefore, became a foundation for establishing the U.S. Southwest as the place where the Aztecs originated, and from where they began to travel, as Huitzilopochtli told them, until they found the place with this symbol. And I think it's very significant that Aguilar is placing that symbol in her face. So we meet her gaze with this myth. And by the way, this myth is not similar to the classical myths of the Greeks or the Romans. And archaeologists are continuing to find a place where Aztlán was. And in fact, when you look at ethnohistoric sources, which are chronicles that the Aztecs themselves wrote starting in 1521, you see that Aztec kings sent delegations to excavate, like our modern day archaeologists do, to try to find this place of Aztlan. And we'll go over that in more detail next time, in the next lecture on immigration.